What if I told you that one of the greatest empires in Europe was brought to its knees in a single battle? A battle that changed the balance of power, forever altering the course of history. This is the story of the Battle of Poltava, a battle that marked the fall of Sweden as a global superpower and the rise of Russia as the dominant force in Eastern Europe. Stay tuned as we journey into the heart of the Great Northern War, a clash of titans, a turning point for empires. Chapter 1: The Glory of Sweden. It's the early 1700s, and Sweden is at the height of its power. Under the brilliant military leadership of King Charles XII, the Swedish Empire stretched across vast parts of northern Europe, from the icy waters of the Baltic to the fields of Poland. Charles, who took the throne at just 15 years old, quickly proved himself a warrior king, defeating all of Sweden's enemies in the early years of the Great Northern War. Charles was bold, fearless, and victorious. By 1707, his military genius had allowed him to outmaneuver Denmark, Poland, and Saxony. Now, only one major rival stood in his way: the vast Tsardom of Russia. But Charles didn't just want to defeat Russia. He wanted to break the power of Tsar Peter the Great, a man with ambitions as grand as his own. Charles planned to invade Russia and strike at its heart, Moscow. Chapter 2: Peter's Master Plan. Peter the Great knew his army couldn't face the Swede head-on, not yet. So he employed a devastating strategy: scorched earth. As the Swedish army marched deeper into Russian territory, Peter ordered his troops to burn everything in their path: crops, villages, anything that could be used to feed or shelter the Swedish invaders. It was a tactic designed to wear down the Swedish army before they could even reach their real goal. Peter's strategy worked. The further Charles advanced, the more desperate his situation became. His army had to endure bitter cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Supplies ran low, morale plummeted, and the dream of a swift victory over Russia began to fade. But Charles was not a man to give up easily. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was the coldest Europe had seen in over 500 years. Known as the Great Frost, it devastated Charles's army, leaving them weakened and vulnerable. Thousands of Swedish soldiers died from starvation and the harsh elements. And yet, Charles pressed on. Chapter 3: Ivan Maipa and the Cossacks. Realizing that his march on Moscow had become a death trap, Charles made a bold decision. He turned his army south, hoping to find reinforcements and supplies in Ukraine. There, he found an unexpected ally: Ivan Maipa, the hetman of the Cossack hetmanate. Maipa was a powerful Cossack leader who had grown disillusioned with Russian rule and decided to join forces with Charles. He promised to provide the Swedes with food, horses, and men. For Charles, this was a glimmer of hope. But once again, Peter the Great had outmaneuvered him. Before Charles could reach Maipa's stronghold, Russian forces under the command of Alexander Menshikov attacked, burning Maipa's capital and destroying all the supplies meant for the Swedes. It was a crushing blow. The Swedish army, now down to half its original size, was left with no choice but to press on ever deeper into enemy territory. Chapter 4: The Siege of Poltava. By the spring of 1709, Charles found himself at the fortress of Poltava, an important military depot on the Vorskla River. Short on supplies and desperate to regain the initiative, Charles decided to lay siege to the fortress, hoping to weaken Peter's forces before they could regroup. But Peter the Great, never one to back down from a challenge, marched his army of 75,000 men to Poltava, determined to lift the siege and face the Swedes in open battle. With both armies now converging on Poltava, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in European history. But fate had yet another cruel twist in store for the Swedish king. Chapter 5: A Crippling Wound. On June 20th, 1709, while surveying the Russian positions, Charles XII was struck by a stray bullet, which lodged itself deep in his foot. The wound was severe, rendering him unable to stand or lead his troops into battle. It was a devastating blow to Swedish morale. Without their king on the battlefield, the Swedes would now have to face the might of the Russian army under the command of Field Marshal Carl Gustav Renskild. But even from his sickbed, Charles refused to give in. He instructed his generals to launch an attack on the Russian fortifications. What followed was a chaotic, bloody, and ultimately futile assault. Chapter 6: The Night Before Battle. Under the cover of night, the Swedish army moved into position, hoping to catch the Russians by surprise. But the operation was plagued by problems from the start. The Swedish cavalry, crucial to the attack, arrived late, having lost their way in the dark. Meanwhile, the Russians had been tipped off, and were already reinforcing their fortifications. When the Swedes finally launched their attack, it was too late. The element of surprise was gone. By the time dawn broke, the battlefield was engulfed in chaos. The Swedes managed to overrun the first few Russian redoubts, but their momentum quickly stalled. Confusion reigned as some units advanced while others hesitated. The Swedish command structure began to break down. Chapter 7: The Russian Counterattack. Seeing the disarray in the Swedish ranks, Tsar Peter seized the moment. He ordered his infantry to launch a full-scale counterattack. Over 40,000 Russian troops surged forward, their cannons roaring, their bayonets gleaming in the morning sun. The Swedish infantry, already weakened by months of hardship, struggled to hold their ground. The sheer numbers of the Russian forces, combined with their artillery, proved too much for the Swedes. The Swedish line began to collapse. Some units fought valiantly to the last man, while others fled in disarray. It was a brutal, bloody fight, and soon it became clear that the Swedes were losing. Chapter 8: Retreat and Surrender. As the battle turned decisively in Russia's favor, Charles XII made a desperate decision to retreat. With his bodyguard and the remnants of his army, Charles fled south, abandoning the Siege of Poltava. It was a bitter defeat, and the Swedes knew it. In the days that followed, thousands of Swedish soldiers, exhausted and outnumbered, were forced to surrender. The battle had cost Sweden dearly. Over 9,000 men were dead or captured, including many of the highest-ranking Swedish officers. The once invincible Swedish army was shattered, and Charles XII was forced into exile, taking refuge in the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 9: A New Order in Europe. The Battle of Poltava marked a turning point in European history. For Sweden, it was the end of an era. The Swedish Empire, which had once dominated northern Europe, was now in decline. For Russia, however, Poltava was a triumph. Tsar Peter had not only saved his empire from collapse, but had laid the foundation for the future Russian Empire, a force that would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries to come. Poltava was more than just a battle. It was a moment that reshaped the balance of power in Europe. The war would continue for several more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Russia, under Peter the Great, had secured its place as a major player on the European stage, and the decline of Sweden had begun. Chapter 10: The Battle That Changed History. Today, the Battle of Poltava is remembered as one of the most decisive battles in history. It changed the trajectory of entire nations and set the stage for new powers to rise. For Russia, it marked the beginning of a new era, while for Sweden, it was the beginning of the end. The consequences of this battle are still felt today, as the balance of power in Europe shifted dramatically in the years that followed. King Charles XII would spend the next 5 years in exile, plotting his return to Sweden. But the Swedish Empire would never recover from the defeat at Poltava. In the years that followed, Sweden's enemies would close in, carving away at its territories, and by the end of the Great Northern War, Sweden would be reduced to a second-rate power. Poltava was the battle that changed it all. Subscribe and join us next time as we continue to explore the pivotal moments that have changed history.